Greetings and welcome back to yet another iteration of MGTOW Talks, and I'm here again with the rather famous Teal Deer, and we're going to be talking about something different this time. So I'll allow Teal Deer to explain the topic because it was his suggestion to begin with. Please.
Okay, so my plan for today is a discussion on autonomy versus autocracy. Basically, is there an objective best way to run a society, or sort of what are the different ways, and do any of them actually have sort of an objective merit over any of the others?
Yeah.
More or less that simple.
Yeah. Well, the question itself sounds simple, and of course it's an immensely complex topic, in particular because so many people have so many different views on this, and most people you encounter tend to side with one political faction or as opposed to another. Now, I have actually correctly been labeled and called a political relativist, even though people are constantly assigning me every label you can imagine, from communist to socialist to libertarian, anarcho, whatever, I kind of supposedly everything. Just because the short and simple answer is no, I don't think you can, but we need to discuss, I think, the reasons why it's probably impossible to create a perfect system.
Yeah, I do think that it is one worth going into, especially since these days, especially on YouTube, there does seem to be quite a cultural clash between two very distinct camps, and I'm never really sure what to call them, but we all know that we have the sort of social justice feminist side over there somewhere, and there's a kind of nebulous blob on the other side, the sort of more libertarian-leaning so-called manosphere of things. And every single time that we sort of see this clash of ideologies between these two people, it does seem to boil down to two or multiple sort of subjective ideas of how the world should work, and that these both different sides sort of seem to state that, well, our way of running it is the objective best way, and here is why. So I think it's just sort of worth having a little poke around all of those ideas and seeing if there is any actual merit to the claim that, well, my way is the best way.
Well, traditionally, if you just go by it along strictly political lines, all the SJW stuff would be called, that's the left and everything else is on the right. However, if you take a guy like Sargon of Akkad, I mistakenly had made the mistake in the past of labeling or calling someone on the right. Apparently, he's essentially left in his politics, but in the same camp, strangely enough, opposed to the SJW tactics. So I think this whole conflict has created a sort of muddying of the waters of what was traditionally, you had this sort of left versus right, and it's gotten a lot more complicated and a lot murkier. Yeah.
Certainly. I mean, we seem to have hit a point, and the way I've been envisioning it is as a pair of horseshoes. I mean, we're all sort of familiar with the horseshoe theory of left and right, that if you go so far around to the socialist side on the left, to the communist side, you basically end up back around on the authoritarian extreme right side. And I sort of view this at the moment as we have this sort of that one horseshoe on, say, an x-axis, and then on a y-axis we have another intersecting horseshoe on top of that, which is the sort of libertarian authoritarian side, and that you can quite easily sort of go from one side to the other, and it's just sort of this very blurred distinction between the two, and that you can fall in some cases on quite different points on each of those horseshoes simultaneously. So you can be left-leaning but still be on this authoritarian side, or you can be left-leaning but still be on the libertarian side, and on the right side you can be authoritarian and libertarian, and so on and so forth. And so we no longer seem to focus as much on the political left and right as we do now. I think the divide is, instead of going left to right so much, it seems to be more between the political north and south, as it were.
Yeah, that's an interesting concept. I don't think I've heard the political north and south.
That's just how I refer to it. I'm sure you've seen that that political compass grid.
Yeah, of course.
That's basically why I refer to it as the political north and south, north being the authoritarian autocratic side and the south being the libertarian autonomous side.
Yeah. Well, I think as I pointed out before in a private discussion, that part of the problem lies in the somewhat unique values that people hold. The reason why they support political ideologies or lean one way tends to be because they think that one particular value or several are more important than others. People on the other side, conversely, think some other values are really important. A libertarian might value, personal autonomy and wealth and prosperity more than he does social cohesion and feeling comfortable and getting a pension on time or whatever. And this just seems to me to create an almost inevitable conflict of interest, if you will, because people do want different things. I don't see the evidence, at least as yet, for some sort of universal plan. Though my impression is that the golden mean seems to be what we end up with inevitably. And we were just talking about, say, on continental Europe, most of the countries are mixed economies, relatively heavily taxed depending on where, some very heavily taxed depending on where, but they're still essentially quote unquote capitalist frameworks. No one, as I pointed out, no one is getting every bit of his income taken away, and the government isn't doing everything. And this seems to be, at least in continental Europe, the way people want it. Most people there are exceptions, there are libertarians in Europe, most people don't have a fundamental problem with the way that works. On the other hand, I'm sure you've heard of Singapore, and well, he's the now late Lee Kuan Yew, who basically founded the place. Singapore was and is more or less an autocracy, and an incredibly successful one in terms of finances and the leaps of progress it's made in the last couple of decades. And all this has been done at the sacrifice of personal freedom and choice to some extent. And then it comes down to the question, what's more important? Well, it depends on who you are and what you want, right?
Absolutely. And this is sort of why I look at this and think, well, how can we best formulate a society, or is there an objective best way, or what sort of objective criteria could we possibly use to work out what a sort of quote best society would be? I mean, do we look at something like economic output? Do we look at productivity? Do we consider individual happiness? I mean, is it possible that we could find an objective term to measure a best society, or are we always going to be sort of chasing this sort of golden ratio in between all of these things, where we kind of end up satisfying the majority, but we just accept that there will always be a minority who will always be unhappy with the system that they live in?
Probably the latter, but then someone who's a dyed-in-the-wool libertarian would argue that that economic prosperity and wealth creation creates all the circumstances for all of these other things that people on the left and people in between actually want. So that is objectively the best system. Never mind the possibility that in the process of creating that wealth, the amount of hours worked and all of that, a person could be very unhappy. He might end up very wealthy, but if you're working a 70-hour week, I mean, there was a point in time in my life many years ago when I worked in Asia, in South Korea, and I was, for my standards, making quite a bit of money. I wasn't happy. I was actually a miserable fuck, and I was working 60 to 70 hours a week, often 7 days a week. I had, if that's the standard, it wasn't a standard for me. I don't want to just make money for the sake of making money. And I think this is the problem. People are individually different. I mean, we all have different genomes, and then we have our genomes interacting with the environment. And I think it's very, very difficult. And what we were talking about before is the problems that arise when you get a kind of a clash. It's all well and good to say, in Saudi Arabia, that's the way they do it. Let them. Women, for example, like being chauffeured about by their brothers and fathers and husbands. But it's different when you try to transport those cultural goods to a different culture, and like in the UK, in your country, where there's actually a fair bit of conflict now.
Absolutely. And this sort of, again, I think comes down to just how subjective a culture and a society can be. Obviously, as a Westerner, I can look at a place like Saudi Arabia and women not being allowed to drive, and I can say, well, that's horrible. Why would you deny half of your population this right? It seems odd to me. But yet, when you actually talk to the women in Saudi Arabia, something like 70 or 80% of them said, no, we don't want this driving ban lifted. We like the fact that we are chauffeured around. We like the fact that our men have to take care of us. And so they sort of see what I see as sort of quite an oppressive way of keeping half of your population. They actually see as quite an empowering thing.
Well, yeah, and I think this is, I mean, speaking of feminism, one thing that feminists and people who claim they are, and women in general, miss is that women have always had a kind of power. It's called power by proxy. To be able to get the men in your life to do things for you, that is power. It's not the power of, the guy with a scepter and he's slamming the table with it, and it's not in your face, but it's a power nonetheless. And in some ways, it's a lot better because, when the shit hits the fan, who takes the responsibility? The person behind the scenes or the person who's actually in front at the scene? So this is something as well that feminists don't understand. Feminists don't understand why they can't, at least they pretend not to understand why Saudi Arabian women wouldn't want a system like that. I mean, look, they're being oppressed. They can't drive. Their husbands have to take care of them. That's a pretty chilled out, relaxed life for the most part. Why wouldn't they want that? And the husband has all this responsibility, legally or otherwise. It's yeah, but for Western standards, I suppose it's strange. But the problem that arises, of course, is when you try to transplant that to the UK, and these guys calling for Sharia law there, and there's just no historical precedent for that in the UK.
Yeah, and that I think is where the clash comes in, and it's the fundamental point comes down to, well, who is right? Is there actually a correct answer there?
I hate to say it, but it comes down to it's right concerning individual X might not be right concerning individual Y. I've mentioned this before to my subs. You all know about the radio tax. I fucking hate it. But in Germany, I have to pay a radio tax in the state I live in for a service I never use, never listened to, etc. But every couple of months, I have to fork over hundreds of euros to them because I live here and I'm told to do that. Do I like it? No, but that's what I'm stuck with. So would there be things that I would tweak in the German system? Absolutely. I would get rid of a radio tax, for example, for a radio you don't listen to. But I think we're kind of stuck in a society where the amount of actual change is pretty limited. Most, for example, Western societies are reasonably well taxed. There's some degree of social services, etc. And I think the reason why that's the case is because there is some consensus that that's what most people want. For example, personally, in my experiences, the NHS is fucking horrible. This is my personal experience. Nonetheless, I know very few Britons would want to go without the NHS. Am I right about that?
Yes, I mean, I can personally say I have benefited greatly from the existence of the NHS.
Yeah,
It's not something that I would want to do without.
exactly.
I look at like the American system. I just think this idea that I could show up at a hospital with something severely wrong with me, and a doctor would just say, "Yeah, sorry, no." That is just such a foreign idea to me. It seems to somewhat contradict the Hippocratic Oath a little bit, but I can't get my head around this idea that you can show up to a place of healing like that and be turned away.
From what I understand in practice, and having spent most of my adult life in Europe, it's hard to judge. But from that, in theory, no one actually really gets turned away. It's just they are treated, and then they're given a hospital bill that they spend the rest of their lives paying off. I think that's based on what I understand. That's kind of what happens. It's rare that people are simply, oh
Yeah,
you're,
they're not totally turned away, but I know that there are cases where people will say be denied a specific treatment. Like they might just be given sort of a pain management
Yeah.
because it's cheap and to hand, and that's what their insurance will cover, as opposed to actually going in and sorting out the problem if it's an emergency.
Well, I think Americans in this regard, talking about different systems would argue, yeah, but when it counts, it's much faster and much more efficient. Would I prefer, I live with the German medical system. Overall, there have been some fuck ups that have been pretty good to me. I would prefer to live under this system. I don't pay that much for insurance. And yeah, I would certainly prefer that because it benefits me personally. However, if I were ultra wealthy and could afford the best doctors in the world and the best healthcare, yeah, I probably would prefer the American system. But I mean, so there we have this conflict of interest. I'm
Mm.
almost certain that wealthy Britons who can afford private doctors go to them, not NHS services, unless they have some, I don't know, nostalgic attachment to NHS. But
It's the case of emergency. That's my experience, and the experience that I've found from people that I know. The NHS is fantastic for emergency. Like, if you show up and you have something very, very severely wrong with you, you will be admitted and seen within about half an hour at maximum, and you can walk into any hospital and it'll be done. But for more routine things or very specialist things, you definitely want to go private. Like, the NHS is terrible when it comes to medications. Like, they will, because obviously they are a government funded thing, they will have the list of express medications that they are allowed to have and that they will have stockpiled in large amounts, and they will just hand those to you. Whereas if you go private, you can tend to get the more either experimental things or simply things that the NHS are not permitted to buy and not permitted to distribute.
yeah. Well, I had an issue a couple of years ago when I was living in the UK. I had a tumor in my neck, turned out to be benign, but it kept on getting misdiagnosed as something else, swollen tonsils, whatever. It was only the fourth time when I had an ultrasound done. So, oh, that's a tumor, and it only really got treated with the biopsy and everything when I moved to Germany. So, but that said, in terms of affordability, from a pragmatic sense, as someone who's not wealthy, yeah, obviously I'm going to opt for a public health option just because it benefits me more, as you said, for emergencies. I also had acute food poisoning when I was living in the UK, and they actually handled that reasonably well. So, yeah, and I think it really just comes down to it comes down to the individual interest, right? As I said, if you're in the States and you're fabulously wealthy, you're not going to have too many issues. It's just if you don't have a lot of money when it comes to medical insurance and stuff like that, that is an issue. And at the end of the day, unfortunately, people are just numbers too. I mean, how much things cost. They're well, I've often, this is slightly off topic, but on the note of the Hippocratic Oath, there seems to me often when I speak to doctors or aspiring to be doctors that the the Hippocratic Oath does tend to be in conflict very often with one of the major reasons most people become doctors these days, at least in the United States, because of the money. People go to med school very rarely because they want to become the great healer or I wish to annihilate cancer from the world. And they think, if I become a cardiologist, I could take in that amount of money and blah, 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 blah. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I've been thinking about this quite a bit. It's off topic, but as far as the Hippocratic Oath is concerned, if you're a doctor, you have this supposed obligation just to treat anyone. But how does that actually work in a pragmatic society of costs and benefits? I don't think it can, right? Uh,
No, yeah, no, I definitely see where you're coming from with that because, let's be honest, you do go into these sorts of professions because at the end of it, there is a lot of money to be made. I mean, if you went into being a doctor and you said, yeah, you're guaranteed to be dirt poor for the rest of your life, no one would do it.
yeah, yeah. I mean, there are a few people, these Doctors Without Borders, they're doing some tremendous work, and I'm almost certain they're not getting rich off of it. But they tend to
But
be,
when they come back, they know that there's something else.
well, they certainly have a great CV. Look, I was helping, poor people in starving villages in Africa. I mean, it looks really good on your CV, I guess.
Mm.
But they're even so. I think they're, as I said, more the exception than the rule. And I think this is something that a lot of people who tend to be on the left they either take issue with or don't understand, or both. But unfortunately, as far as profits and loss are concerned, human beings are part of that equation. When you're going to hire someone and factoring that person in, how much you're going to pay them, etc., you're just a number to the company. I mean, yes, you're a human being in some vague sense, but as far as costs and profits are concerned, that's what it comes down to. And this is something that feminists get confused all the time as well. It's not systematic sexism so much as systematic maximum profitability when considering, say, a female candidate who might get pregnant, who might take off more days from work, etc. They don't understand that is how the world works, whether we like it or not. I don't know what your view on this is, but I think it's just something we have to accept, that there's an element of sort of this cold calculation that is always taken into account when dealing with businesses and profits, and indeed health as well. There's a reason why you have people standing in a queue saying, I can't afford this vital operation that was going to save my life, and I might die as a result. Now that's horrible, but the reality is, I can't imagine a world that we could create where this just happens like magic, where, oh no, you need a vital operation, we'll do it for free. There are charities, sure, but generally speaking, everything comes down to numbers, and this seems to rub people the wrong way, and I guess it is unpleasant to think about. It makes us seem really nasty and brutish, but I can't think of a single company that actually isn't run that way.
I think it's the flawed belief that they have that all humans can be totally altruistic, which is something that they seem to think that we can do, and that if we built a society in the correct way, everyone would just suddenly stop looking out for self-interest. A perfect example of this was someone who, I think his name was like Bad Mouse or something like that, did a response to one of my videos. He calls himself an anarcho-feminist, which is a term that I instantly laugh at. It's like, how can you be an anarchist against the government but support feminism, which is an ideological movement which is totally 100% in bed with the government? You can't separate the two. But he sort of has this idea that if you removed government and everyone fundamentally what he's advocating for is anarcho-communism. This idea that if you had an anarchist society where everyone voluntarily gave up all of their things, we could distribute it all equally and everything would be sunshine, roses, and unicorns everywhere. But it ignores the fundamental principle of you will always have someone who will look at this and say, well, I grew these crops, I made this computer, I built this car, why should I give this stuff away? And could we ever come to a point where you could have a society where everyone would just say, yeah, I just put in 100 hours of work over here, time to give that thing away for the greater good? Yeah, and I think it's quite a naive view, and it very much ignores this idea of personal choice. Like, well, okay, even if we treat everyone equally, well, we have two kids here. Okay, well, this kid's interest might be sitting in the library every day reading books. This other kid might spend all of his time just going outside, running around, playing. That's a personal choice. I mean, how are we supposed to treat them equally when they grow up, when one will grow up to be, say, a very well-educated, smart person, whereas the other one just spent their time running around? Yeah, they might become a fantastic athlete, but that's not going to pay as many bills or be as great a benefit to other people as, say, the kid that grew up reading all the books and went on to become a doctor. I mean, how are we supposed to, work this out? I mean, how do we account for this level of autonomy that people have?
Yeah, and I think this is something you bring this. It's a good point, because even very famous people like Noam Chomsky, who is he's a narco-socialist basically, has these are guys. A guy like him, for example, who's just so steeped in the sciences, and yet doesn't, in my view, doesn't understand basic human motivation. I mean, the idea that, as you said, you could just put in 100 hours of work, time to give it all the profits away. Very, I would argue, almost no one is like that, and everyone has some degree of personal interest, and I don't. That kind of vision just couldn't work on principle. I mean, you couldn't get a society where there's going to be some very sort of inherent, deep-seated resentment, I believe, when someone is working really hard and it just gives it all away. I mean, I suppose some there might be some freak out there like that, but
Well, I don't think it would be resentment because if they voluntarily gave it away, they couldn't resent it. But then I think this is what comes down to my view of this Marxist communist view of doing things is in order to achieve that, you must have some sort of central authoritarian figure that will take things away from people who will not give them. You will never convince people to voluntarily give away their things, like everything that they work for.
yeah, yeah. But I would argue that a lot of people like that. I mean, the government is a force. It uses quote unquote force, but living in society, most of us give our consent. I mean, I would prefer actually to live in a society with a police force, as fucked up as it is sometimes, than one without it. With firemen, etc. I mean, I could all of these things be privatized and what have you. I'm sure, but I don't think that's feasible because I think most people are in agreement that it's probably better to have a publicly funded police force or fire force than privatizing everything. And
It's an ease of access point, I think, because
yeah,
going back, this same anarcho-feminist nonsense person decided to make the bold statement that all government is inherently immoral, and I look at that and I say, well, no, because if people want to be governed, it's not your place, especially as an anarchist, it's not your place to tell them that because otherwise you are becoming the government, you are enforcing your will on them, which you really can't do. So if in a situation where you say you had 10 people living together and they all say, well, instead of all going and doing our own individual food shopping, we'll just give this much money to this person and they'll go and do it all for us. It frees up the time of the other 9 individuals. The 10th person gets a job. It's created something for them to do. Now, granted, they are then the one making all of the decisions, so all the 9 people might not always get what they want because, the 10th person might come back with cornflakes when 5 people wanted Cocoa Pops or whatever. But the reality is you wanted to be part of that system because you benefited from it more than you suffered as a result of it. And I think the point that a lot of people miss when they talk about the immorality of the state is they just say that a government is inherently immoral. Whereas in a situation that I've just presented there, it's a form of government. It's very rudimentary and very simplistic, but it is a form of governance. And there's nothing immoral about it because everyone wanted to be there. They all agreed. And I think the point that a lot of these anarchist types miss is the only point where a state becomes immoral is when you don't have an opt-out clause. When you're born into something, it's like, nope, you're part of this system now. Screw you, you're not allowed out of it unless you sign away your citizenship and go through all of this and basically aren't allowed to be here anymore.
well, yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, but United States, speaking of this topic, is fairly unique, and it's I think one of 2 or maybe 3 countries in the world that double tax as citizens. Now, I don't make nearly enough money to technically fall into this category, though in theory I would have to, I have to file and tell them blah blah blah. But yeah, in the United States, if you make a certain amount of money and say live in New Zealand or the UK, you have to pay taxes in both places. Rather absurd, since taxes in some sense are an agreement that you're paying for certain services to be rendered onto you, taken away from your salary. Now, talk about authoritarianism. Fairly recently, the United States government put into effect a policy where if you're an American and you hold a bank account in a foreign country, it's not every country, but whatever country has an agreement in the United States, they are required to report your information to the IRS and the American government on pain of receiving penalties and all transactions that take place in the United States. I think upwards of 30%. And I think that there we're moving into that authoritarian thing where it actually starts bothering me. I think a certain level of government is probably necessary because that's just how human beings work. I mean, look at the way the world, most of us have some kind of government and are in favor of, we might not like everything, but in that particular case, it just seems to me real overstretch, threatening foreign countries and banks with financial penalty for not revealing information about Americans for a tax worse that Americans are supposed to pay doubly. It's pretty insane. And I think a lot of the fear of, say, inherent evil comes from the potential of overreach. And I think it's a case, say, of the American government overreaching. I mean, just imagine paying taxes in two separate countries, even though one country you're not receiving any of the benefits or the services.
Yeah, that is an absurdity. That really is. As far as I'm concerned, when it comes to a tax, first of all, I think when it comes to a sense of morality on that issue, you have to agree to, first of all, the taxes that are there. Like, I think this idea that there is no sort of opt-out clause, that's one of the sort of inherent points of immorality on it there. But then this idea that, you can be charged by a country that you're not even living in,
Yeah.
that no, you are in no way obliged to that, because you're not benefiting from the existence of that country. You're benefiting from a service provided by someone else within that country.
Right, but this is a perfect example of what you were talking about just before of, it gets problematic when they say, well, this is just the system as part of it. Now, I rather coincidentally was born in the United States, hence I have birthright citizenship. Hence, I have a birthright tax, meaning no matter where unless I renounce my American citizenship, if I were ever to earn a certain amount of money, which I think is upwards of 90,000 USD a year, which I might probably never will, still, I would be obliged to pay taxes in two countries. And yeah, that's an example of not being able to opt out. And if you do want to opt out, that is renounce your citizenship, it's amazing how, because people are doing this in droves now, the U.S. government has been increasing the amount of money you have to pay, penalties that's going into the thousands of dollars now just to renounce your citizenship. So this is an example of something that, yeah, you don't really have an opt-out clause unless you want to pay lots of money to do it, and then you're also losing other benefits. It's a strange thing. I guess that's a bit of a rant. It's something I absolutely hate about being an American, but you can understand why.
Yeah, absolutely. That does seem to be a very immoral thing to do. Just this idea that it's like, yeah, no, just because you were born here, we now lay claim to everything. And if you want to live somewhere else, well, you've got to pay us for the privilege of leaving.
Yeah.
What?
There are all sorts of absurd cases that have arisen from this. I remember one case I read about a guy who was born, spent a day or 2 days in the United States. I think it was in Seattle. And then his family, right after that, moved to Vancouver. It might have been an emergency pregnancy in Canada. And yeah, he owes taxes apparently, backfiled taxes to the U.S. government. It's insane, but
That is ridiculous. It makes me wonder if they start going really far down this route, if we're going to see interesting cases of pregnant women going north and south over the borders to Mexico or Canada to give birth, just to then come back into the United States.
It could
just
be
to
like I
it.
said. FATCA. That's what it's called. I don't remember what it stands. The Federal Act of anyway. This thing called FATCA. The IRS literally went to governments and financial agencies and banks and said, if you don't force American citizens to comply and give us their data, their private bank information, every transaction you try to make in the United States will suffer a penalty. Profits, interest, everything. It's absolutely horrible. It's an extreme example of a government abusing its authority, and I think that's one aspect of what I can completely get on board with traditional libertarianism. I say, look, there's no moral justification they can offer for this. All they can say is, we got the guns, so fuck you and comply.
Which is rather conveniently the second point that I always find very immoral about governments. Because you have no opt-out clause and you must comply with what they say, there is always the threat of implied force if you don't. There's sort of no amenable way. Ultimately, it always comes down to, well, we're either going to tase you and stick you in a room where you'll never see the light of day again, or worst case scenario, we'll just kill you.
Yeah. And this is... I mean, in theory, they've done this to, track down billionaires and multimillionaires with their offshore accounts. But it's really the middle class little people that are getting hurt the most. and because they find out that, oh wow, I didn't even, some of them didn't even know they apparently owe the IRS money, even though they spent, I don't know, 30 years living in Australia. I owe you money? Why? Well, because you were born in the States, of course. Oh, okay. Uh, it it's
You've taken nothing out of the American economy. Unless I suppose the only way they justify it is because you were born here but didn't stay here, this country has lost out on all of these years of your labor. But that's a very flimsy pretense.
yeah, but
Because otherwise you've not taken anything out of that economy. Why should you have to pay to then prop it up?
yeah, and the funny thing is, the countries which are so heavily taxed in Europe, they don't have this policy. You don't pay if you're born in Germany and move to Argentina, you don't pay taxes to the German government anymore. It's just absurd.
Yeah, the tax is there to pay for the services that you are entitled to use within that country. You might not use all of them. I mean, some of them you'll very rarely use. I mean, hopefully you will never have to use the police force or the fire service, or
Yeah,
hopefully you would hope you would never have to use that. But the point is you're paying and it is there should you need it.
yeah, exactly. And
The idea that you're then paying for that when there is no I mean, what happens? You pay all this money to America and you live in Australia. Are you allowed to phone the American police force and say, I was just burgled?
well,
I've paid you all of this money in tax. I want to start using your services. Fly the FBI over here and sort this shit out.
yeah, response time 3 days. Give us a bit of time there. Yeah, no, it's really baffling, and there's no, there's just no explanation for it. It's not as, I mean, there are people who engage in tax protests in the United States within the confines of the United States, but for this other thing where you were born for a day in the United States and move away and never spend a day of your life there, it becomes really absurd. And I've thought about occasionally I have dual citizenship, renouncing my American citizenship, but there are other benefits I have that I get from being an American, and I still have family there, and it's a difficult decision. It's not because I have any patriotic attachment to it, but they're just practical benefits as well. So it's a strange situation to be in, and I feel like I've made us veer completely off topic, but it is relevant because it is government overstretch and
Well, it
abuse of
is still
authority.
autonomy versus autocracy. I mean, what you have there is quite an autocratic, authoritarian way of doing things, which in some ways very much infringes on your own sense of autonomy, because you find yourself in the situation that you are saying, well, I've made this personal choice to move somewhere else, and now someone else is effectively sticking a boot on my neck and saying, you sure you want to do that?
Yeah,
Pay me off.
the land of the free. Yeah, I mean this is the supposed land of the free, whereas all these quote unquote socialist countries like the Netherlands and Germany don't have that policy. But yeah, so I do. I mean, I think reasonable people realize that most people naturally are inclined to be governed by something. And they also naturally, even some of my most liberal left wing friends, and for better or worse, I have a bunch of them, see the absurdity of a double tax, that is, paying taxes in two countries. As much as they love taxes, for example, very few of them think, oh, that makes sense. So I think you can get a general consensus, if only by just looking at people and their basic behavior. Most people, for example, want a fire force, and most people want a police force. There are exceptions. So I guess what we do end up with is a kind of majoritarianism at the end of the day. It's not perfect. It's really far away from perfect, but nonetheless, most people agree to live in this society. We could, if we wanted, if we were really autonomous, just move to a cabin in the woods in some remote place and just live there. We wouldn't need to deal with any of this stuff, and yet we choose not to.
I think again because it's the benefit ultimately. I think for a lot of people outweighs the cost.
Exactly, and I'm the same way. Do I love having to pay a radio tax for a service I never use? No, but unfortunately, it's a package deal, and so if I want to live in this particular society, I have to do that.
And
Unfortunately,
I'm sure there's plenty of benefits to living in Germany that
oh yeah, like I said,
easily outweigh the downside of having to
medical
drop a few quid.
Yeah,
into a service you never used.
yeah, medical. Like I said, I've had two operations since I've been here, and they all went reasonably well. I was, taken in pretty quickly to the hospital, and so yeah, I mean, overall, it's really not too bad. I mean, there are little things that I find ridiculous. We talked about before diminishing returns in a heavily taxed system. You see that pretty acutely in Germany. I can't speak with any authority on other countries. Well, I could speak, I guess, France. I lived there, but I've spent most of my time in Germany. And so the problem, for example, here is that let's say you take a part-time job and you start earning this, you only work a couple times a week, maybe 450 euros a month, which is very, very little, but still. The minute you go over the 450 mark, you start paying taxes to the point that if you're earning 600 euros a month, start getting diminishing returns where the time output, the amount of time you have to put in, isn't worth getting I forgot how much exactly is taxed at that bracket, but you're probably only getting 10 or 20 euros more than you would if you were just working for the 450 without the extra tax. So there are problems. For example, diminishing returns, and then of course the more money you make, the higher the taxes you pay, because this is something that bothers a lot of libertarian-minded Americans, the idea that there is a kind of consensus in socialist-minded countries, if you want to call them that, or left-wing countries, that the more money they make, the more obligated you should be. This is not necessarily my view. I'm just saying this is what people feel, to pay higher taxes for the benefit of all. And I've never had a time to interview or talk to these people who make that amount of money. But I'd be very curious to hear about, from a Danish man who earns a lot of money. These guys pay 60, 70% tax on their income. And the idea is that everyone should enjoy more or less the same level of comfort. And that kind of just rubs me the wrong way in a sense. And maybe it's because I was born in the United States, but just if you're making more money, then you have this doctrine of everyone should enjoy the same amount of comfort that in some ways it certainly would disincentivize you to make more money. Why even bother? And this is actually what I talked about in a recent video, the amount of hours worked and stuff. Most Europeans don't see, they take more pleasure in leisure and not working than working, because there's not much incentive to working more. You get as you get higher and higher, the diminishing returns on your income. Americans, on the other hand, it tends not to be the case, at least supposedly. But it really, I think, there's a guy named Turd Flinging Monkey. I don't always agree with him. In fact, I disagree with a lot of him. But he did make a point. He said, the left-right kind of socialists, free living, libertarian, it basically comes down to valuing sort of personal mobility and freedom over fairness versus fairness. And yeah, that's what it comes down to. So if you want to live in a fairer society, then ideally, you would agree to fork over more of your income if you make more money to the government, so everyone can enjoy a similar standard of living. I don't really know what my stance on this is, because sometimes I'm resentful of certain things that I have to pay for because I don't benefit from them at all. I don't make a lot of money by any means, but I can imagine if I did, I would be scratching my head saying, why am I paying all of this? I can't keep any of this. Why am I even working this amount of money per week? Because I can't keep this. I don't know what your thoughts on that are, but the idea of just sort of fairness versus, freedom and mobility.
It comes down, I think, to my ultimate stance against the sort of Marxist mindset that, this is a system when you forcefully extract wealth from people. I think people will tolerate it to a certain point because they do realize that, it's a necessity thing and they do benefit from it. But when you start getting to a point where you're taking the majority of their money or all of their money and resources, they just say, well, there is no incentive for me to do well. There is no incentive to excel because there is no point in competition, because being the best at something will bring you no benefit. What you're going to do is effectively drag the top down rather than pulling the bottom up. Because, and this is, I think, the difference between a sort of capitalist versus a communist mindset. In the communist mindset, you might as well be the bottom of the pile, because if you're the top of the pile, it doesn't matter. You're treated the same as the worst. Whereas when you go into a capitalist system, if you're the best, not only do you personally benefit, but then something which I think a lot of these Marxist and social justice types, which seem to be one and the same these days, seem to ignore is the trickle-down effect. It's like if you're wealthy, you actually do spread that around. I mean, I don't know any rich people who hoard all their money in a Scrooge McDuck style vault that they go swimming in. It just doesn't happen. It's like, you're ultra rich. Okay, well, I want to live in a big house. Cool. I now have to pay 100 people to work 100 days to build it for me. You've spread that money around. What you've excelled at, hypothetically, assuming you weren't born into the money, has been put back into the economy. You're spreading it around.
Yeah, I mean, there was certainly, I'm sure you heard of the American robber barons in the 19th century, who supposedly, depending on your point of view, exploited lots of people, blah blah blah. But a guy like Andrew Carnegie was a great patron of the arts. I mean, he founded a university, Carnegie Mellon. I mean, I don't think you're advocating Ronald Reagan style trickle down economics per se. I don't know if you are, but there is certainly
probably not, because I don't know what Reagan's view is. I've not heard of it, so okay. I'm not going to say. I'm probably going to say no, but that's only because I don't know exactly what it is.
Well, I think there is a trickle down effect. Absolutely. I mean, people who are quote unquote productive and make money, they add to the economy. But I mean, part of the other thing is this notion of class warfare. This idea of envy and resentment. I think that's natural. It's just human conflict of interest. I can say that as a person who in a relatively low income bracket, that I don't pay, comparatively speaking, as much in taxes as someone who's making triple or quadruple what I'm making. And I don't really have a problem with it because the services are being spread even. But if I were that person, maybe I would have a much greater problem with it, because then it would be in more my personal interest to argue my case that I keep more of my income. And I think it all comes down to this whole notion of fairness. I don't believe you can create fairness. It's just, I'll go as far as say I don't believe in either equal outcome or equal opportunity. I think they're both fabrications.
Yeah, you can never have both, because even if you socially leveled the playing field on every capacity, you're still going to have people born 7 foot tall and people born 5 foot tall, exactly. And there's going to be advantages and disadvantages to both, and you're not going to change that. And the person who is born 7 foot tall can go on to be a basketball superstar and make millions. Yeah. But then what happens? Okay, they die. Well, we take away all of their money, redistribute it, and reset society at, first of all, how much cost to do that every time a new generation is born. It's ridiculously impractical. But people are not, it's an idea that I think a lot of the very, very ultra-leftist people will hate me for saying, but unfortunately it's true. People are not born equal.
No, I mean, not only are we not born equal, but it's just, you can't create equal opportunities because of that. I mean, I've gone on record. I said, you could take a clone of me, Thinking-Ape Stardust. I was born in a middle-class, educated New York City household. That in itself is a pretty big advantage. You could take my clone, put him in a poor mining village in West Virginia, which is one of the poorest states in the United States, and it's almost certainly not the case we've been having this conversation. Very few of the opportunities would have been available to me. So I don't think you can fix this. We can call it a flaw, but it's a fundamental flaw of the world and human beings, that there's neither equal opportunity or outcome, because we're all born different, born into different circumstances. Sometimes the circumstances are surmountable, sometimes they're not. And then once again, you get these extreme cases, guys who are naturally athletically inclined, people who aren't, people who are good with numbers, people. I mean, it's an impossible task to even attempt. And I think it's one of those things you just kind of have to accept. I mean, I never was going to be a particularly athletic person. It doesn't really bother me. I don't have a huge interest in sport per se, but what if I had been? I would have had to accept that. So I think this is one. That's one point I would give to the more libertarian side. That what's all this talk about fairness? It's impossible to even reconcile this with being a human being in the current world we live in. Maybe if we genetically modified everyone, we could somehow come closer to that. But that leads us into other dangerous territory.
Yeah, but I think that's ultimately what a lot of the social justice side goes down to. I mean, I can't help but look at their sort of idea that all humans are equal, and because they promote a lot of like race mixing and things like that, I look at it and I think, isn't this just almost like a socialized form of eugenics? Like you are actually trying to eliminate biological differences between people, which seems very contradictory to their doctrine of loving diversity.
Right. Well, their idea in general is to just force stuff. It definitely is something that rubs me the wrong way. I mean, freedom of association. I think we talked about
Mm,
this last time. If you want to hang out with people who are ethnically different, go for it. If
yeah,
not, don't go for
absolutely.
it. Whatever you want to copulate and reproduce with people who are ethnically, go for it. I mean, none of this bothers me, and
Yeah,
do
it's all your
whatever.
personal choice.
Exactly.
Whatever what makes you happy, go for it. As
But
long as you're
they're
not harming other people,
but
crack on.
these guys, they definitely tend to just want to add an additional layer of force. And I think they're that's where you get this kind of more subtle and layered version of the anti-feminist or what have you. A guy like Sargon of Akkad, once again, who's very, by his own admission, very much left wing, still very much at odds with sort of the forcefulness of social justice and the movement in general. Yeah. Even though at the same time, he himself probably doesn't mind paying taxes and is in favor of the NHS and all this other stuff.
I don't know. I mean, I would assume so because, well, lives in the UK, so I'd assume he's benefited from some degree. I've never heard him say anything about like opposing taxation, but I suppose it's
No,
not really
no.
something that
I found
comes
out
up in any of his
I made a
stuff.
mistake. I thought to see this is why the lines are so blurred. This was a while ago, but I just assumed, if you were going to go against the SJWs, you were some sort of right-leaning libertarian, usually, almost invariably. So I just assumed that was his position.
Hey, that's what
And
the social justice warriors claim. They're so far left that even if you're on the left, you're
oh,
still to the right of them.
yeah, yeah. Well, I suppose, yeah, yeah. I guess in some really disturbed sense, yeah, he's right wing, but not in the sense that I thought he was. And so he corrected me. I was mistaken about that. But it's very interesting how that has led to this. But ultimately, the problem is we're not going to have a single good answer to any of these problems. And maybe all we can do is just sort of let the world spin and see what happens. I think things naturally evolve. I mean, there's a reason why most people in Europe favor a mixed economy, for example. For whatever reason, this in their perception seems to be most beneficial to them.
Mm.
And yeah, there are people who are unhappy in Singapore. Actually, a lot of people because it's autocratic. But on the other hand, there are people who like the economic strength and the growth that has been accompanied by essentially an autocracy. I, and maybe if they'd been born elsewhere, they'd think differently. Maybe if they had been born, in Holland, they would think completely differently. I don't know. And certainly, I have to attest to my experience as someone who's lived in a bunch of countries, mostly European ones, and versus the United States. I find almost as a consequence of that, yeah, that I have kind of mixed views. I mean, I don't find myself completely on board with all the European stuff, but neither do I feel myself completely on board with the American stuff in this regard. So I don't think I guess there's no one shoe size fits all, and that does make me a relativist if I say that. I guess I'm a relativist, but I don't really see what other position I can take because when I look at the world, that's what the world is telling me, that there is no, particularly politically, one shoe size that fits all, you know?
It would definitely seem to be that way because all you have to do is look at, I mean, just different cultures. And, well, if you're a proponent of sociobiology, which as far as I'm aware you are,
Yeah.
It's sort of this idea that, you know, there is a root cause, or a possible root cause, as to why all these different cultures and different societies have grown up the way they have. Some of it down to simply society reinforcing itself, and some of it down to environmental stresses and things having to be that way because it was the most efficient, or even if it wasn't the most efficient, it was the most beneficial course to have taken.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you sort of look at that and think, well, is there a way that we could, you know, do we just leave it as it is and say that, well, this is autonomy? It might not necessarily be the autonomy of every individual, but it's a kind of majoritary autonomy where most people are okay with it, and therefore it'll continue moving in this direction. And I think the only way to sort of counteract that is to have this ridiculous totalitarian goal of saying, no, we are going to autocratically dominate and control the world, regardless of individual personal opinion, which I think would be a terrible way of going about changing it. I think that the change in societies that we see are just going to be a sort of natural evolution.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, you know, I've said before, society is what we are. You know, society is never going to be something that completely runs counter to what we are biologically and how we evolved. You're going to get a lot of variation, of course, but those, I think, ultimately will be variations that you can explain along evolutionary lines, and as to how it works and why it works, and indeed historical lines. I mean, one of the reasons, I think, why there's strict gun control in Europe, with the exception of Switzerland, and I know libertarians are going to cite that, but most countries, is, you know, Europe had centuries of internecine, interstate warfare. I mean, at some point in time, they just got tired of all this stuff. And
it's just easiest to stop letting people carry pointy things.
yeah, pretty much. So, you know, that you can explain it along those lines, and people here are cool with that, whereas Americans wouldn't be, because they like their guns. It tends to be a more violent society, etc. So I guess we could say that autocracy, depending on how extreme it, well, no, autocracy is probably a bad thing, if any aspect of it, perhaps. Although, as I mentioned before, there are these guys like M.J. Davis Orini, these monarchists who are essentially these Hobbesians, who think that it's good to have an enlightened tyrant, you know, see what the benefits are, that human beings aren't intelligent enough to govern themselves. And, you know, I don't know if that's the case or not. Sometimes, you know, we were just talking about Pitalass. And
yes.
right.
How long would you last in the wild governing yourself?
Yeah. Well, if anyone's interested in instantly losing faith in humanity, I suggest you check out a channel named Pitalass. If not, don't do so. But yeah, so these guys have that view that an enlightened monarch is the way to go. And
actually, on the topic of monarchy, I found a very sort of interesting viewpoint. I can't remember who it was that stated it. But it was basically that the reason that a monarch is supposedly better than a government is because a monarch actually has in their best interest improving the country, because they have to hand it to their child. So they actively want to make it better, as opposed to a government who is only concerned with the next 3, 4, 5 years, you know, however long their term is.
Yeah. And another argument I would add is that monarchs obviously tend to stay in power longer. So, I mean, obviously, open revolt and hating the monarch can lead to bad things. So you have a kind of
Absolutely.
a lifetime interest in preserving some semblance of peace, prosperity, and harmony, some semblance of it.
Whether you do that with an iron fist or an olive branch is debatable then.
Yeah. But though I think, you know, if I could live the same lifestyle I am now with, you know, some monarch who's the head of the state, but he lets me do what I'm doing and whatever, I wouldn't really care, to be honest. Yeah, I'm not saying that's necessarily would be the outcome, but if that were the same for me, I probably wouldn't care. As long as I can, yeah, be relatively autonomous and kind of do what I want to do, I don't take issue with that. So
I think it comes down to the amount of intervention. that we see. I think people don't mind a small amount of intervention, but when it crosses a line, it starts becoming an issue for them, and they start becoming like interested in it. And I think what we sort of seem to be arriving at here is this idea that, you know, people do like a degree of rule, and I think there is actually sort of some biological precedent for that within our species, because I know that human beings actually respond very positively to hierarchy. They respond very positively to this idea of knowing where they are within a sort of social pecking order.
Yeah.
But I think there's a sort of point where people will just accept that because, you know, it's kind of a good thing. They don't really complain about it. There's no real downsides. There's some benefit. But when it starts being forced a little too far, that is when people start saying, okay, I've got a problem with this. And I think it's a case of finding a sort of golden ratio between so many factors of, you know, not only individual productivity, but also of individual happiness. And then sort of how much can we take from each other, where we sort of look at it and say, that's a fair contribution, compared to how much can we take before people start saying, you what, mate? That's my pocket. Get your hand out of it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, but I wonder if people who are of any extreme political ideology take that aspect of things into account. You know, a hardcore dyed-in-the-wool libertarians to say, you know, minarchism is the way to go, or I guess if he's an anarcho-capitalist, then something even less of government is better. But and I don't think he's gonna. I mean, if what we're just talking about is the sort of golden mean idea, is the primary driving force, you're going to have to get rid of a lot of ideological underpinnings. You can't really be an SJW person. You can't really be a hardcore libertarian. You're going to have to see what sort of overall brings the most benefit to society. And I don't think that's what motivates people and their ideology. That's not. Oftentimes, it's just, you know, ego investment and
they must be right.
Yeah,
regardless.
Exactly, and in really cynical cases like the Anita Sarkeesian case, I mean, she's just her business. I mean, her job is to be an SJW and make random comments and be a professional victim and make money off of it. That's just what she does for a living, you know, and it's a difficult position to be in. You certainly can't renounce that if you want to keep on making money that way. So, what are you going to do? It's the whole question is given people's extreme poles and where they tend to, it's almost impossible to answer. And yeah, that's why I'm a fully committed political relativist.
I think it does always come down to a subjective term of what do you as an individual think is best for society, and then you sort of have to sort of look at that and say, well, how much of this idea correlates with those around me? And I think in some ways this is actually a very good case, and I would imagine someone is going to quote mine the hell out of me for saying this, but this is a sort of good case for, I'm going to call it organic segregation, like just sort of a naturalized segregation of not like people, certainly not, because obviously anyone from any walk of life, from any ethnicity, any religion can have whatever views they want and obviously are open to change them, but the sort of idea that people will naturally segregate themselves based around how they think a society should be run. And
Absolutely.
I think the sort of best thing that we can do is allow different civilizations to exist. Like, we can't ever tell someone objectively, like, no, your communist system is wrong, we will have nothing to do with it. And no one can say, oh, capitalism is completely wrong and it should be burned and dismantled and so on and so forth, because that's just you asserting your subjective opinion on someone else. Now, you will always have evidence for your opinion, I'm sure, but you will always also have evidence against your opinion. And so I think we need to have this sort of segregated, sort of organically segregated world where you have different societies all in different areas, but the most important thing that we can aim for is to allow free movement from one to the other. So it's not kind of like you were born in this society, we will punish you if you leave it, and you must, under all circumstances, cow down to our way of doing things. You should be able to freely move from one to another based on how you think it should be done, so that you can be with like-minded people, because there is no, or there would appear to be no objective best way of doing things.
Yeah, I would agree, but I don't think the Infernal Revenue Service, sometimes called the IRS, would agree with that. But yeah.
Oh no, they would hate that idea. I'm
But
sure.
that's why I don't have an issue. People, I'm an atheist, obviously. You don't have an issue with Saudi Arabia? Well, it depends on what you mean by that. Do I want to live there? No.
Yeah.
But let them do their thing. It has
Yeah.
nothing
If they
to do
choose
with
to
me.
live their life that way, who am I to say otherwise? I think the important thing that we can do is, I suppose I'm going to come off as an ultimate hippie here, but just say, if people want to live their lives in that way, you just have to accept it.
Yeah, exactly.
And not to go to war with them over it, as we have been doing for however many 100 years now.
Yeah, well, they're. I mean, things get even more complicated when you talk about things like colonial interests, and I mean that the whole notion of feeling guilty for a colonial past.
That's
Uh,
absurd.
well, yeah, I mean,
I'm
you have
not going to
nothing.
feel guilty for something someone else did.
Yeah, no, obviously, but I guess it's a somewhat separate issue. But
Or is it? Because we do have to consider, while I've just put forward this glorious idea of, utopian society where everyone can have their own societies and they can go all around, the important thing that we haven't actually addressed, which we mentioned at the beginning, is, of course, environmental factors. Different areas of land have different things.
yeah, no,
And
absolutely.
people will need it. And obviously, if you run, say, an anarchist society somewhere which possesses all the gold, well, they might not want to export it. Or, I mean, I suppose you'd have individuals. So I suppose an anarchist society would be a poor example. If you had like a totalitarian regime on the land that had all of the world's gold resource, and they say, absolutely under no circumstances are we going to trade it outside our borders, therein lies the problem. Everyone else either has to respect that and say, okay, we will find a way around this, we will find a way around the fact that we don't have this resource and build our society appropriately, or they do what we have historically done as a species and simply just walk on in there and take what we need.
Yeah, I think that's probably what does and will almost always happen. I mean, look at Africa. It's got so much in the way of natural resources that
Wealthiest continent in the world, isn't it, when you
yeah,
break it down into its
yeah,
constituent
absolutely.
parts?
And I mean, it's now for centuries a lot of people just walking in and taking what they want. And this is not me saying, "Oh, the evil white colonialists," but I mean, because a guy like Mobutu, the late president of Zaire, now Congo, I mean, he exploited the shit out of his own country. He didn't care about his people, and he was in collusion with the Western powers. So it's yeah, what to do about that? I don't think there is a solution to that problem. It's although I've actually seen some pretty interesting discussions led by Africans themselves who were maybe this has something to do with it, educated in the West, and they advocate very interestingly enough fewer donations, fewer charities, and more kind of investment in actual infrastructure so Africans themselves can do things.
That makes complete sense, actually.
Yeah, it does, and they think it's
Because the example that I've heard is so this idea that if you have an economy that is basically reliant on food parcels, well, there's no incentive for the farmers to grow anything, so their infrastructure never carries itself. I assume it's basically just an extrapolation of that logic.
probably, yeah, and never mind the fact that a lot of these charitable donations go to dirty hands, and it doesn't necessarily reach people, and some of the donations are ridiculous. I saw one report where a bunch of fancy, expensive high heels were donated to a village in Africa where the people walk around barefoot. They didn't even know what to do with them. So it's sort of a misappropriation of resources. They don't even need the stuff half the time. So it seems. So yeah, I'm all for just letting people do whatever they want as long as I can do what I want and live in a society that I'm reasonably comfortable in. But Yeah, we were just talking about this as well. This how in recent years this buildup between SJWs and I don't know what to call them, anti-feminists or people who argue with SJWs. This has been really intense, and only in the last few years has it reached this level of intensity. And I mean, I have a couple of ideas with why that's the case. One idea is I actually just think these are new markets, basically, and because YouTube itself is kind of a market. Well, you have the SJW market and the anti-feminism market, and it's just a new. These are just new market niches, and so they're codependent. You
You
can't
can't
really.
have one without the other.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So I mean, I'm not faulting people engaged in the market at all. I mean, everything's a market at the end of the day. But yeah, as long as there's SJWism, there's going to be the correlate, the opposite, and they'll just go back and forth, and there'll be a kind of, in some cases, infotainment, in some cases, actual refutation. It'll never reach a kind of synthesis or an end. I don't think it's just because it's a niche market, but it's a pretty profitable one, I think, especially for SJWs and people. Look at Anita Sarkeesian; she's really good at making money by doing very little. Um, but you also, I mean, you offered the idea of just increased narcissism
Absolutely. I mean, well, point out Piddle-ass again. I mean,
yeah.
who wants to watch? Who wants to watch people go around shopping and talking about what was it? How she got locked out of her flat.
Yeah.
Well, apparently millions of people want to watch that.
Apparently, yeah, yeah. So I don't know how much of this is just a larger outcropping of, as you put it, the bread and circus, which is kind of just YouTube and internet entertainment in general. I mean, I was shocked. I wasn't sorry. I'll be lying. I wasn't shocked when apparently, for those of you who aren't in the UK, I don't watch television. I was aware of this. I have lived in the UK, but didn't watch television. There's a show, according to Teal Deer, where people who cook and fry fried chicken are filmed, and then they sell it to people, and that's filmed too. And this is successful. Is that right? Is that more or less what happens?
Yes, it is. It's a reality TV show. Yeah, there it is. You can actually look it up. I don't know if you get Channel 4 like online on demand
probably could
sort of stuff in Germany. It is actually just called The Fried Chicken Shop.
Wow, that's creative. Okay.
And it's just a sort of fly on the wall series about people who cook fried chicken and sell it to people. It's just awful.
Yeah.
But that's what we've come to in society. I mean, we've got another show here in the UK called Gogglebox, where you basically it's just a camera on top of a TV set in people's homes, and it films people watching a television program and films their reactions to it, and people watch it. Millions of people watch it. It has like online games, like video games, and a board game franchise built on it. It's shocking.
I definitely want to do some serious, intense research on this subject. I mean, things like Piddle-ass or the Chicken Shop or what's this called? Goggle
boxes in like
goggle
like
box.
swimming goggles.
Right. Okay, because I can't relate to it at all, and I often think it's a generational thing, maybe, but it just baffles.
When did we
me.
become so entertained by the mundane? That's what I want to know, because all you have to do is just type in on YouTube reaction videos. I mean, there's entire channels with millions of subscribers, which is just like watching people's reactions to things. For some reason, this is interesting to people. And I can't really say very much, because I suppose that's the fundamental principle of what my channel is built on, so I can't really complain about it too much.
But you go into significantly more depth than just reacting to.
Yeah, I don't just look at something and shout and scream, but I mean, the core premise is not that much different.
True. The reaction genre, the response, I call it the response genre. Yeah, whether it's responding to SJWs or whatever is a pretty big niche. I mean, that the guy you criticized, the guy who was humping the ground, Oriason or whatever his name is,
Onision.
Onision,
Onion boy.
Onion boy, right? I mean, I think that's what his channel is. It's sort of just responses to stuff. It's that
Oh, he has 3 of them. At
three.
least.
Oh,
At least. He claims that they're all for different topics, but I can't tell the difference between any of them. They're all the same mundane tripe on all of them, as far as I'm concerned.
yeah. I've only watched a few of his things, but he's another perfect example of someone who doesn't really produce anything, to my view, that's interesting or worthy of listening to or watching, but lots of attention. The thing that's the thing that's I get, for example, the quote unquote girl gamer channels where they're hanging their tits out. I mean, at least I can understand why people are watching it. Mostly men who like looking at that.
Basically, softcore porn.
Yeah,
we know that pornography has been an industry for centuries.
Exactly.
This is not a surprise to anyone.
I get that, but when I look at Piddleass or Onus, fuck his name, whatever, that guy, I don't get it. It's not something that's because there's just soft porn makes sense. That stuff, not to me. I don't really. There probably is research. There probably doctoral papers on this. I don't know.
Oh, more than likely. I mean, some things like the girl gamer channels, especially on the Twitch streams, that sort of thing I can understand because it has that kind of. I don't like referring to it as sort of a pornographical level, but I suppose it is on some level because you can tell that there are
it's sexual
people who certainly take advantage of it. But they do the sort of the fan interaction, the you call in and I will do something element. So I suppose there's kind of a bit of, and I notice it does seem to be more women that do that than men. There are absolutely men who do it as well. But I think that there might be some sort of user titillation to it, this idea that, oh, if I pay you, you will do something. There's this kind of I'm controlling another person thrill to it.
And I certainly, and then some of them go pretty far. I don't have a problem with that at all. If
no, not at all. I mean, if they can make a living off of it, more power to you. I'm absolutely fine with people doing that.
And although I personally wouldn't watch something like that, I do, and I can understand it. I can understand why people would give money to these people, specifically these girls.
Oh, there's a wonderful quote. I don't mean to cut you off here, but it's a wonderful quote which I heard from. It was a woman who worked in the porn industry. She'd sort of worked her way up and was managing her own company. And she was explicitly asked in an interview, it's aren't you exploiting women? And she said, hell no, we're exploiting stupid middle-aged men with credit cards.
Yeah. Well,
there you go.
Yeah, exactly. So I get it, but some of this other stuff, the Piddleasses, even the PewDiePies, I mean, supposedly it's a gaming channel, but I don't get anything game relevant from it. I mean, there are good gaming channels out there, informative, where you learn something about modding or computer specs or even just, I don't know how to find stuff. When I first started playing The Witcher and I couldn't find some artifact, I could look it up on you. It's useful, But then there are these other things that I don't know. It's a social phenomenon that really exceeds my understanding. But I would love to know what the root of it is and why we're just as in human beings mesmerized by this sort of mindless drivel that you tend to get, and it's also immensely popular. I mean, I even there with channels with a purpose behind it, a sort of a focus. I get it. For example, Michelle Phan, the famous makeup guru girl who started this big thing. I mean, I have no interest in it, but I understand why her channel is appealing to women.
Yeah, there's a display of talent going on there. There's
they learn makeup tips. She has her own company now, blah, blah, blah. All makes sense to me. But these kind of guys who just make these responses and Enison, whatever his name is, I keep on forgetting, but that guy. Or they're the brothers. I forget. There's another group who, they make these videos that get millions of views by filming people's reactions. So there's old people's reaction to blah blah blah, or teenage reactions to old console platforms. It just boggles the mind. But and I don't know what the reason is. Is it just excessive narcissism? Do we maybe because people see themselves in this everyday, ordinary scenario? I'm not sure, but I'm at a loss. I'm at a loss of
I
the
can't
phenomenon
explain it.
of pit alas. Other things are understandable, but sort of vlogging just for the sake of vlogging, no, not really.
Yeah, it's like, why should anyone care about what someone else did with their day? And yet, apparently, millions of people do. I've got to wonder, is it maybe something to do with the fact that we're maybe breaking down as a society? We're becoming sort of less personable, where we have like less close bonds with each other, and so we sort of open up lots of very shallow, vicarious bonds with people on the internet. Like,
Almost absolutely. I mean, even depending on who you are, all my subs know it. I'm a pretty hermetic guy. I still have some old friends, but I spend job wise, whether it's making videos or translating, proofreading, whatever, I spend all my time on the internet. So by default, 90% of my contact these days is that, and I think that's true of a lot of people. Our bonds are definitely a lot less close with people. We tend to interact a lot less with people. I'm not I'm not assigning value or judgment to them. I'm just saying that is what's certainly happening. And yeah, I think it's kind of a giant superficial friendship, if you will. You know, to sort of put you're watching someone's vlog and you're sort of in their life, but not really, kind of thing. It could be a consequence of that. Yeah, we're not as.
Mm,
I mean, a lot of traditional conservatives complain about this, and I mean they're right to some extent. People in the neighborhood don't really know each other anymore. People don't, they used to invite each other, neighbors used to invite each other for dinner, blah, blah, blah. Everything has become very depersonalized,
mm,
and the internet is a perfect platform. And frankly speaking, I don't know how to go back to that because, like I said, every job I do now is on the internet, basically. So, you know, when I'm not working, I'm still on the internet because I'm just there all the time. And in addition to work, the internet offers me, social possibilities, entertainment, games, movies, whatever. So, yeah, just almost by default, as again in my case, why would I, run around the neighborhood looking for people to hang out with? It just doesn't really make much sense. And I don't know if that's the case for everyone, but I think to varying degrees, it is. And the other thing is the real life interaction requires a lot more effort, I think.
mm.
You need to be much more mindful about things. It's a lot less casual. Usually, it's a lot less laid back. You have to, depending on the context, you have to pay attention to what you're wearing. You have to, your facial expressions. It's a completely different approach to things. Whereas the internet is just kick back, say what you want to say. Of course, things can be taken the wrong way, but still. So maybe it's just easier for people to interact this way, and by extension, people sort of appreciate these everyday looks into people's everyday lives, even though I don't find it particularly interesting. I'm just throwing some ideas out there. I don't
Let me
know.
throw a bit of a curve in here, then, if I may.
Yeah, sure.
Um, I'm going to sort of open up with something which Total Biscuit said, and he said that the reason he doesn't give his subscriber base like a name, like you get PewDiePie calls all of his fans his bros.
Hmm.
It's sort of, and Total Biscuit said that he doesn't do that because it gives people a sort of false sense of belonging, like they're in some way personally connected to him when they're
Sure.
not. Like it's a distinct business, content producer, content consumer. There is nothing else going on here,
Hmm.
and what this sort of makes me think of is, does this necessarily have anything to do perhaps with breakdown of family units? Because we have social justice warriors who frequently divert to the sort of Marxist way of thinking, who say the family unit is inherently oppressive, it's an evil thing, it needs to be banished from society, which then leads us, because we don't form these acute bonds to very close members, we instead have not only lots of little vicarious connections to lots of other people, and that this is sort of then a sort of a manifestation of that. This idea that we are just sort of compensating for it because of something which is lacking in our society, and so we're changing our society accordingly. And the reason that I sort of go down this route is because when you said there, um, in-depth social ties with people in real life require a lot more adherence to social convention. You must be mindful of how you're behaving, what you're wearing, facial expressions, and all this other sort of stuff going on. And whether then, because we don't have that anymore, people are becoming worse at it. We're sort of effectively giving ourselves like mild forms of autism, like hear me out here.
No, I'm not, dude. I'm not laughing, dude. Mate, I'm laughing because I agree with you. That's fine.
I know. Excellent. Hear me out here, because I think this is gonna go somewhere good, which is gonna ruffle some feathers. We're basically giving ourselves like a sort of artificial form of autism, because we don't form those close bonds. We do everything vicariously through the internet, which has this kind of disconnection to it. And this is why, when we look at the social justice side, we see all of these people doing what is considered to be socially unacceptable things, like, I'm a woman walking topless down the street, fucking deal with it, get over it, because I don't have the social skills to do any better. You must accept my really shitty attempt at it.
Yeah.
Is there some sort of correlation between all of these things?
Well, I definitely I mean, I'd never described it as that, and I might be reluctant to describe it as that still, but definitely. I mean, I think I could practice again. I could get good at it again, but I am socially out of practice. I'm not awkward so much as, like I said, all my work, whether it's making videos, translating, it's all done on the internet. So my interaction, not all the time, but 90%, apart from old friends, it's done on the internet. So yeah, I mean, it's easier that way. Also, I'm wearing shorts and a t-shirt. I couldn't do that in an office environment. There's so many elements to that. So I do think it makes us kind of less at ease socially, and I would agree with you that calling it social autism, maybe it is. But I really agree.
Obviously, no offense to autistic people. I know I have quite a few of them subscribed to me because they've mentioned. So no offense to any of you guys. I'm using it as a kind of catch-all term for people who are bad at the social interaction thing.
What I saw most agreement, and what I was most in agreement is the whole feeling of belonging. I watch Total Biscuit sometimes for consumer reasons, and he's been ruthlessly businesslike. He's never, you're my bros, you're whatever. And even when he had, I think it was bowel cancer, he just said, "Oh, I was surprised how many people are concerned because I'm just this business guy." And I can really appreciate that. Whereas when you don't go down that route, you immediately have a kind of community. There's not a really community for Total Biscuit. He doesn't even have a comment section, right? He's banned that. So especially, like, say, the phenomenon like MGTOW, it's inevitable that there's a sense of sort of belonging and whatever, even though some opinions and views just are radically different. And I've read comments by guys, and just based on those comments, yeah, you might be MGTOW going your own way, but I'd like as much 10,000 miles between us or more if possible. So
would that be the sort of people who call themselves MGTOW? Because I know we sort of touched on this a little bit. I can't remember if it was the last discussion we had or whether it was a private discussion about those MGTOW who basically say, no, you must agree with this person because he's MGTOW. Like, you're not allowed to dissent.
Well, they're people. They're definitely people like that, but they're just they're. Well, put it this way. I mean, there's this rubric MGTOW, but it doesn't mean you're going to have your everyday interests. There's this one guy. I have nothing against him as a person, but we just have radically different views. The only thing he, for example, he doesn't play video games. He's kind of a workaholic. He works in a bank, something that would never interest me. And so, yeah, we're MGTOW, but we have nothing in common. So why would I, no offense, but why would I talk to you? More stuff like that. But when you have a rubric, right, people kind of feel a sense of bonding and belonging. And that's something that Total Biscuit has totally done away with, right? Because he's just a businessman, and you're the consumer. And I kind of appreciate that. But, for better or worse, I think you're part of, for better or worse, the anti-feminist camp, so, that's kind of where we're at.
There is definitely a sense of community, even when I don't want there to be one.
Yeah, but I think, but this this sense of community is, I think, particularly strong in the whole vlog phenomenon, right? Because that's just everyday stuff. Oh, I did that too. Oh, I was locked out of my flat too. I can totally relate. And then you have this litany of comments about, I don't know, how it was a pain in the ass to get to the locksmith or something. Who knows? But there's a degree of relatability, and people look for that, especially if we have this sort of disconnect in real life. In real life as well. I hate to use this term, real life. Is the internet not real life? But this is how we describe it, right? So
It's true.
in real
Online, offline, real
in
life.
yeah. So in offline real life, it's actually a lot harder to find people to get along with. Why? Because the internet is a virtual universe into itself, and so you can find people who like Fallout. I don't know if you watched. If you said you do games sometimes, but if you
Yeah,
haven't watched,
Fallout is not a franchise that's ever interested me,
oh, okay. I was
unfortunately.
going to say the Fallout 4 presentation stuff was great, but in any event, or well, you can get that, and then you can get the forums, and everyone starts talking about it, and so you're ready. You have common interests, right?
Mm.
I mean, it's hard to walk out in the street. I guess you could do a survey. Everyone raised their hand who's interested in Fallout. Bethesda did an amazing presentation. Or you get stuck in an office. I know I had been with certain people. In this case, they were women who were. I don't know if they were declared feminists, but they certainly seemed to go in that direction. It was a couple of years ago. And these are not people I want to hang out with. But here I'm stuck in this office and I'm getting paid to do stuff, and they're there too. So what do I do? There's a greater freedom with the internet, and so I think in some sense the sense of belonging is easier to create because you can pick and choose who you associate with much more easily. You don't choose. I mean, everyone has shitty family members, right? The Uncle Joe who's a drunken alcoholic who no one likes, or the mean old grandmother or whatever. You can pick and choose on the internet. You can see what their interests are. They're interested in Elder Scrolls. I think you're interested in Elder Scrolls at least. So
Absolutely.
and what have you. So, yeah, you can. I mean, it might not be the deepest of bond and whatever, but there are people out there who share these interests, and the vlog thing is just an extension of that. I think it's just people kind of seeing themselves in these vloggers talking about their lives, and yeah, it's just a universe unto itself, and the universe of real life, offline life, is just minuscule. It's so tiny compared to that. There, it's so tiny as to these days appear foreign to me. There's just very little of interest apart from occasionally doing workouts or sport and going shopping for food or whatever. But I just why bother? Whereas and working as well. I feel very fortunate now to be able to work from home from the internet, because when I worked in an office, there would be these unpleasant people I'd work with, or the obligatory company dinner where you're thinking, oh, work's over. Fuck, I have to send a restaurant for 3 hours now with these people that I don't like in the first place, so I can't go home till 3 hours later. And you can get away from that. So it's pretty. Obviously it has its downsides. The bonds are between families and friends are all the lesser, but what are you going to do about it? The internet, barring some catastrophe, is here to stay. And even if social conservatives complain and rail against it, that's the way it is. I mean, this is what we've evolved into, and the internet is the biggest thing, I would argue, the biggest thing socially to ever happen to human beings in the last few hundred years, without question. It's totally reformed our social dynamic, in a sense, the way we interact. I mean, look at this conversation. You're not seeing my facial expressions, any of that stuff that's so vital to a quote unquote real conversation. And of course, it leads to things like Poe's law. You know Poe's law, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
right. Where, wait, are you kidding? Oh no, was that sarcasm? Oh no, I get this asked all the time.
Mm.
I was complimenting an online acquaintance of mine the other day for she's not a native speaker of English. She used a really kind of witty English expression. I said, that's a really good use. And she said, "Wait, was that sarcasm?" And it was totally not sarcasm, but she thought it was anyway because Poe's law. I think if she had seen my expression, maybe that wouldn't have been the case. But I'm particularly enthusiastic about this topic because, well, I'm involved in it. I'm part of the whole devolution of social bonds, and yeah, it's ongoing. But I think you definitely hit the nail on the head. It has created a kind of social autism, and less of a need to get along. I mean, we talk about these extreme polarities, right? You know, social justice warriors and the people opposing them, and console peasants versus PC master race members.
Mm.
And you know, if you have to get along in a real life, offline real life community, you're gonna take measures to be, you know, more polite and
Yeah, you'll be more diplomatic with people you disagree with, as opposed to just being able to remove them entirely.
exactly, exactly. And you generally don't have that. I mean, yeah, you can block people or whatever, but you don't have that on the internet. People interact and they argue, and sometimes the arguments never end. There was a in your one of your recent videos, I just made a small correction. I said, well, the thing you're reading off of was Latin, actually not French, and I don't know how it got into that, but I think there's like 60. There are like 60 comments on this one thing that has nothing to do with my comment. Two guys just arguing back and forth. I think his name was Soldry, and some other guy. You probably didn't see it, but it's a really, really long.
I've got all of the notifications. I don't even open them anymore.
Right, right. Well,
close them and
size,
send them away.
Enough. But it just goes to show. I mean, in real life, I can't. I guess it could happen, but it's almost certainly not going to be the case that people just argue back and forth. You know, oh, 3 hours have passed. Oh, another response. I'll respond again. So, yeah, I think we're in real life situations a lot more socially inept, but maybe this is a new form of social interaction. I mean, people talk about, you know, virtual reality and Oculus and stuff, but maybe this is just the first step. Maybe this is the social interaction without all the facial expressions, without, you know, seeing what you dress, how you dress and what you're wearing. And it's not a question whether it's legitimate or not. Of course it is, because there are probably billions of people engaging in this kind of social interaction by now. And I mean, I'm certainly not going to condemn it because I'm a participant, and I don't know if it's good or bad. Time will tell, but it certainly has produced some interesting phenomenon. Although Total Biscuit has gone down a very unique route. I think inevitably you create a sense of community when you run the banner of anything, be it, you know, anti-feminist, nominally, you know, MGTOW, nominally, going my own way, whatever, gaming, you just kind of get associated with that, and people naturally who identify with that associate themselves with that also. You might have nothing in common, as I said before, with the person, but because you have the banner, you're Teal Deer, the anti-feminist, so, you know, people will flock to your side. You might not have anything in common with them. You might not even want to have a beer with a lot of them, but, you know, there's still that. I think that's just the way the internet, in particular YouTube, works. People with one vague interest all kind of flock together and then form a kind of community. Yeah, I don't know. I've been talking a lot. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's sort of where my own thoughts were going, but now it makes me wonder something, which is basically going into the darker side of like internet subcultures, things like the furries and the otherkin and the headmates, the deepest, darkest sides of Tumblr.
Man, I'm so out of the loop. I don't really pay attention to feminists usually.
Doesn't matter. I shall explain.
Okay,
I shall explain.
Thank you.
We'll go with what I think is the most harmful. Well, I will briefly explain furries because it's hilarious. You know, they're basically people who believe that they are animals, and the otherkin, they think that they are actually animals trapped in human bodies and all of that sort of nonsense. People think that I'm one because I have a deer as my logo for some bizarre reason. But the most damaging of all these online trends that I find, or one which I think is the most damaging, is this idea of headmates, which is where people claim to basically have split personality disorder. Like they have multiple voices in their heads, and they do this thing where they say, I have this personality of this person, and they're fronting. You know, it's like I was being this person, and then I went over here, and then this voice in my mind was fronting, meaning they were controlling their actions. And they make it all sound like it's some sort of wonderful little drama TV program sort of thing. And it's a very, very damaging trend. And the reason that it's damaging is because people who actually have like legitimate split personality disorders, they end up usually miserable. Many of them end up taking their own lives. Some of them end up in therapy for years because they're unable to cope. They have no autonomy. Some of them end up, full on assisted living in institutes because they cannot take care of themselves. And this community, most of it, I think, is complete bullshit. I think it's just people making up a load of drama for attention because people will egg them on and say, oh, look at you, you're so unique, you're so special and so different. But it makes me concerned that you get people who have like a legitimate disorder, like they're actually hearing a voice in their head constantly screaming at them to kill themselves or something horrendous like that. And they go and they find these online communities and they feel some sense of solace. And rather than like thinking, holy shit, this is a condition that needs treating because it's weird, they feel accepted instead.
Okay.
And this, I think, is one of the darker sides of the internet, that you get these people who feel like they have a bond with someone who might not actually have this problem, who might just be making a load of shit up, and then they don't get treated for what could actually be a very severe mental disorder. And I think parts of like the online trans community suffers from this as well. Transsexualism is obviously a massive topic, which I don't want to go too much into. I do think that there are people who genuinely have a hard wiring in their brain where they look down and think, why is there a penis there? I can't feel it, or they look down and think there should be boobs here, but there's just not. Like their brain is genuinely firing these nerve endings in such a way that they think that it should be, but isn't. But I think there's a lot of them who basically just do it, for attention. It's like, oh, I'm just choosing to be a different gender because it makes me feel special, because I'm different, because it means that I'm not a straight white male. Any excuse to not be a straight white male, I don't know if you saw that NAACP woman.
Like I said, I'm when it comes to all this social, I just ignore them. I'm just not.
But basically, there's a woman. She's part of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in America. Very dark-skinned, very curly hair. Looks black. She's not. Both of her parents came forward and said, "Well, this is her birth certificate. We're both from like the Czech Republic and Sweden, and she's our daughter, and here's our birth certificates." And she's not black in any way, shape, or form, but she's convinced herself that she is. It's got her a very, very lucrative job on the NAACP and all sorts of other benefits. But remember, white people are the privileged people. If you're not white, you're totally discriminated against. Remember that. But this is what I'm talking about. Like, you get all of this stuff online, and people, they're desperate to fit in some cases, to these small niche communities for that sense of belonging. And I look at it, and I can't help but think that this is potentially very, very damaging for people. I mean, going back to, like, the headmates example, if you have this genuine psychological condition that is making you miserable, that, like I said, makes many people kill themselves because they can't handle the stress of it, but they feel like they're accepted somewhere, and they look at it and they say, oh, well, it can't all be that bad because these people make it sound like fun, so I guess I'm not going to go and get the help that I need. For this mental condition that they have. I'm pretty sure there are people like that within the trans community who are just like, oh, today I'm a woman, tomorrow I'm a non-gender, binary, poly-whirling something or other, whatever ridiculous label you want. But they feel acceptance because of it.
Yeah. Well, I think there's
and
always...
obviously, sorry, I don't mean to, I know I'm going on here, but if the internet didn't exist and you were living with, like, your normal family, those sorts of conditions, your family, your friends, your community would look and say, you have a problem, please fix it. We are going to get you help, and this is not going to be an issue for you anymore. Whereas we don't do that now.
I mean, as far as the trans, I mean, I think they're legitimate neurological. It shows, I've seen some studies a few times that show that these people have different brains.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, but, I mean, that in itself, there's nothing, internet or not, that's just not people just aren't really cool with that, usually. People are, the way society is, whether it's offline or online, people tend to take issue with, so, I mean, who's this woman now, who's now a woman but was a man, who involved in Gamergate? I keep on forgetting his or her name.
Oh, Brianna Wu.
Right, right. Wasn't she a man before or something?
Yes.
Right. So there you go. This I think this is going to be an issue. That particular thing is going to be an issue regardless. As far as other stuff is concerned, yeah, I mean, I even read something a while back. You know what a cutter is, right? You know, people that
Yeah,
right?
self-harmers, yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I even heard that there's a forum for people in self harm. They talk about how the positives and how it makes them feel, and they kind of feel satisfied when doing. I didn't look through the forum, but that's
Yeah,
what I
there
heard.
are places like that.
And yeah, it makes it accessible when in all likelihood it's pretty harmful behavior. But it's like anything though. The A bomb destroyed two cities in Japan, but nuclear power plants have their uses as well. The reality is most new innovations are a double-edged sword. The internet, it can be really liberating. It can be a source of income. It can be all these things, and through the depersonalization effect, it can also have negative consequences, like the ones you cited. But I'm not denying that they exist. It's just that what are you going to do about it? Once again, the internet is here to stay. We could encourage people to be, more social in a traditional way, but they're not. And I think, and this is, I don't think it's nearly, well, I don't know how bad it is. I mean, I'm saying this as a person who's pretty mad. I just say this from a neutral point of view, given what I do and how I go about things. I have some contact with my old friends occasionally, but most of my life takes place on the internet, and I don't get that impression from most people. I think most people still have something going on their real lives. I mean, for example, take my friend Barbarossa, who's very involved in the internet, but he has a much quote unquote richer real life than my real life. I'm saying this in neutral terms. I don't know how bad it really is. Sometimes I wonder if it's you know people talk about the devastating effects of blah blah blah, but I guess it's just going to depend on the individual. But where there's light, there's dark, and what have you. So there's nothing we can do about that. There's going to be a negative to the internet, of course there is, but it's not going away. And frankly speaking, I don't want it to go away. If the internet went away, then yeah, I'd be back to standing in front of classrooms, in front of people that I don't want to talk to or teach, and pretending all sorts of things, such as smiley faces and how I like them, and no, so. I just it's that's a pretty complicated topic, and is there a solution to it? Probably not. As long as there's the internet, there's going to be these
I
various.
suppose in some ways we're going to go full circle here. We've talked about autonomy and autocracy in the real world. I suppose we're going to see that on the internet. I suppose we already are to some degree.
Well,
We've
yeah,
got
I
the
mean,
social justice side. You can't say that on the internet because you might offend someone, and other people saying, well, free speech. Offense is never given, it's only
well,
taken. I'm allowed to say it. Get over it.
the Jives guy, right? I mean, I don't know if you guys know, but Teal Deer made a sort of a video documenting this guy Steve Jives, apparently some guy in the atheist community who believed that women are the usual, women are oppressed and men blah blah blah, and Teal Deer pointed out a lot of his errors and what have you. And it seems that you've been sort of blocked off of his Twitter feed, or I don't pay attention to Twitter, but that's one thing I don't pay attention to. But something like that, you can't look at his Twitter.
Yeah. He's banned me from viewing his Twitter posts or anything to do with him on Twitter, which is very unusual considering I've had no contact with him
Right.
in any medium. I literally just kind of made a video about him. That's it, and he's just sort of said, "Oh right, okay, well, time to stick my fingers in my ears and make sure you can't interact with me in any way, even though you never actually have."
Yeah. Well, and you get a lot of these SJWs who are just make a comment I don't like, it's banned, or they just have no comments, whatever. I mean, it's a completely different approach than Total Biscuit. Total Biscuit, I think, is just I'm just a businessman. You're just the customer, so no comments. It's not the same thing. They're trying to sort of regulate things and regulate speech and yeah, and it's it's real on the internet. I mean, I've been flagged before. I know Barbara. People try to curtail what you're saying sometimes. Fortunately for me, my videos are so long and quote unquote boring that I doubt any feminists have the time to pay attention. Some of my subs have struggled with it, so I have less and less that problem. But yeah, I think that this is a real thing, freedom of the speech on the internet. What can you say? What can't you say? And how certain thing. One thing that the internet has done that's fascinating is it's not even quote mining so much as you say one wrong thing, it goes viral instantly. Was this case of some woman? I think was she a comedian? I don't remember her name, but I think she was originally from South Africa. She was flying back, and she made some relatively callous joke about HIV and Africans and to a friend or something on Twitter, and then she lands the plane a couple hours later. I think she was flying from New York to Johannesburg or something, and there are people with like microphones and interviewing. Did you really mean that? She didn't even know what was going on. It was like 10 hours before. Taking things out of context and becoming Twitter famous or infamous for just saying certain things. This seems to me would be impossible without the internet. Do you think there could have been an elevator gate, for example, without the internet? I mean,
Oh no, absolutely not. I mean,
yeah.
we've had. I mean, there are examples, I suppose, of outrage culture from before the internet, but it was always something that was drummed up with a sort of concerted effort from newspapers or something like that.
Mm.
It was nowhere near on the scale that we find. I mean, it seems almost every day now there's some sort of new internet outrage.
Yeah, what boss? Oh God, some of the man spreading. I wonder that without the internet, I don't think you ever would have gotten legislation passed against quote unquote man spreading in New York City, for example.
No, it would have to have been a much more generic, like public service, please keep your feet off the seat sort of thing, which
Yeah, yeah,
already exists on most forms of public transport anyway.
yeah, exactly, exactly. So I
But
think
the sexually charged nature of it, the distinctly sort of man spreading, that element wouldn't have come in.
yeah. Well, this is once again the dark side of the internet, the outrage culture. I think a lot of it is, frankly speaking, just cynicism, like the Anita Sarkeesians of the world. I mean, she's just there to make money. She doesn't believe any of the stuff she's talking about. Probably cackles to herself at night. Look at all these idiots giving me money. They think I believe this. And yeah, the man spreading thing seems just cynicism. And yeah, the police department taking advantage of it in the form of quotas. That's more cynical. Oh, I get more quotas now. So yeah, there definitely is a dark side to the internet, and I mean that's why ultimately what you do and is pretty important. I mean somebody needs to address all these weird SJWs and feminists out there. I think there's definitely a role for that. I don't want to. I just find it too tiring. I find it really tiring just repeating myself over and over, talking about the same thing, which I think is kind of a danger being involved in anti-feminism because you just, once again, talk about the wage gap. Well, how many times do you want to debunk it? Because they're not paying attention anymore. They don't care.
Well, it's because they're able to shut down opinions they don't like. They're able to block people who disagree with them. They don't actually have to address their critics.
Yeah. What's his name? Mike Buchanan, the head of what is it? He's sort of a
Justice for Men and Boys, I
right,
think.
right.
Something like that.
Yeah. How they just even when he's talking about statistics that he seems quite familiar with, they just don't pay attention really. They sort of change the goalpost. I just don't know how amenable these kinds of people are to evidence, and is it just going to be some eternal battle between two forces in lockstep that's just never going to end? That's my impression.
I think it's going to go the way of the creationist versus the atheist thing.
Okay.
Like it's going to have its kind of boom, and then it'll sort of go away onto the back burner as everyone just gets bored with it, and everyone just kind of accepts there's this side over here, there's this side over there. Let's let's find the new flavor of the decade.
Yeah, well, I've been thinking that myself, but it's certainly still very much near, well, it's still pretty intense, I think, the whole SJW and stuff. But yeah, people eventually will get bored of it, I think. Nobody really watches the whole atheism creation thing. That's so early 2000s, you know?
Well, exactly. I think there's going to be, I think, a bit of a mission creep. Like, the atheists or the atheism plus did their mission creep into feminism to try and stay relevant. And feminism in itself, from however many decades ago, has kind of mission creeped into the intersectional feminism now, whereby it's all about gay rights and trans rights and rights of non-white people, even though that's nothing to do with feminism. But that's why they've put this intersectional thing on it to try and stay relevant. And I think that's what's going to happen with the whole feminism, anti-feminism thing. That in like 10 years' time, there's two sides will still be there, but they will have just very slightly grown. Like in the same way that Gamergate has kind of grown. Like we all know that Gamergate is supposedly only about ethics in games journalism. Let's be honest, it's not really. I know I'm probably going to get a lot of flack from Gamergate supporters on this because, oh no, it's all about, yes, it absolutely is about the whole ethics or lack thereof in games journalism, but it's like a separate front to the issue of anti-feminism as a whole. It's like you've got, a 10-sided dice, and this side is Gamergate, and this side is anti-feminism, and this side is MRAs, and this side is MGTOW. They're all kind of different fronts of the same thing, and it grew out of the general view of, no, you don't have a right to tell me what to do, and your assertion here is wrong.
Yeah. I think
so. I think it'll just mission creep outwards.
In all likelihood, I'm just intensely curious what's going to take its place. That's my feeling with Gamergate as well. I know technically it's about ethics and journalism, but it just seems so much to be a front for the whole anti-feminist thing.
I think it's the fact that like the majority of people who support Gamergate are also like anti-feminists. Like it's just sort of a Venn diagram where the circles cross over a hell of a lot. Like there will be people who are in Gamergate purely for the journalism issue. They don't really care about anything else. No. There absolutely will be people like that, but I think there's a lot of people who are part of Gamergate because it kind of coincides with their already anti-feminist or anti-social justice view.
Yeah, I don't. I'm just really curious. I can see how the whole creationism versus atheism thing died down. If the current flavor of the decade, let's say this runs another 5 years, the whole maybe I'm just not creative enough. I can't envision what's going to replace it as the next flavor of whatever. I mean, the vlog stuff's always going to be there. The inane, mundane entertainment stuff's always going to be there, and the mundane response stuff. But I
think it might actually go to full-on libertarian versus autocratic approach, that we are going to go to autocracy versus autonomy, because that seems to be where it's going. When you look at the escalation of the SJW side and the escalation of the opposing side, it fundamentally boils down to, you can't say that, yes I can. That seems to be where it's going. It's the, even going back to the anarcho-feminist nonsense that guy was talking about earlier, he was just sort of saying, like, no, my subjective way of running the world is the best way.
Yeah.
And you are free to do as I tell you, sort of thing. Whereas the other side is, no, people are free to make their own decisions. Any trends that grow out of those personal decisions are just that. They are trends.
Yeah, but do you think anything after, let's assume that it dies out after a couple of years now, and do you think anyone's gonna take anything from it, for the idea, for example, that men are supposedly a privileged class when it's just the evidence doesn't show that at all, at least in most regards? Do you think people are actually going to take that lesson home after all of it, or are they going to just keep on talking about it, in the sense that I imagine most people who were back involved in the whole atheism creation thing, they learned about evolution and they learned about this and that, and they learned their lessons and that was it. Do you think there's people are actually absorbing this and realizing that this narrative is just inaccurate, say the feminist narrative?
Impartial people who are on the fence, yes.
Yeah.
Which is why I think in like wider society, you're seeing that only about 20% of people identify as feminist, whereas you get like 80% of people who believe in gender equality in somewhere like America. That I think speaks volumes. It's this idea that this particular word, this particular branding for gender equality is, you know, it's associated with too much other stuff, and no one wants to have anything to do with it. But the majority of people do support this idea of gender equality. So I think, yeah, it may go away eventually. So people are sort of absorbing the message, but you're not going to convince the full-on dyed-in-the-wool people because they have too much invested in it. I mean, look at people like Nate Sarkeesian. Their life depends on it. You know, feminism is a multi-million-dollar industry, an international multi-million-dollar industry. People whose lives depend on it are never going to hold their hands up and say, you know what, I was wrong.
Yeah.
Because as soon as they do that, you know, keep in mind, they're chucking out people with gender studies degrees left, right, and center. I mean, what are they going to do? As soon as they say, you know what, everything I've spent the last 5 or 6 years of my life doing is bullshit, I'm going to give it up. Yeah. Same problem with, you know, you've invested all of this time. Are you going to give it away? Of course you're not. You're going to stick with it.
One thing that's talked about often in MGTOW circles, and I've talked about it frequently, is what's important is not so much feminism, but its legacy. That is to say, and Gerwight's what has talked about this, and when she says it, people just gloss over it. But the reality is, you don't need to be a feminist to benefit from the things specifically that women have received from the various feminist movements. Be it in the form of welfare checks, a boost in education, preferential treatment, say in the case of science jobs, which you've cited, etc. I mean, I think all of this ultimately is a legacy of feminism, and or you know, spending more money on breast cancer as opposed to prostate cancer. So even if nobody wants to call themselves a feminist, I think a lot of people, specifically women, would, if they really believe in gender equality, whatever that means, I think it's nonsense, but say, well, oh, look at the poor men. They die at similar rates of prostate cancer to breast cancer, but they receive vastly less money. We need to fix this. I don't see anyone doing that.
No, but that's, I think, the gynocentric nature of our species speaking.
Yeah, no, exactly. But that's my point, is that you can get rid of feminism, but gynocentrism is just kind of...
that's here to stay. I don't think we're going to get rid of that. We might be able to highlight it and make people a little more consciously aware of it, but I'm really not sure that it's something that would ever go away, because people will always have that sort of instinctive level.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's here to stay, but I think that needs to be pointed out because I have seen, you know, it is possible to make someone on the fence realize certain things, at least. People who formerly were indoctrinated into, I guess, you know, feminist propaganda, or what's really become standard propaganda. You know, recently I was talking to a female online acquaintance, and, you know, through long talks over time, really became quite reasonable and seeing different perspectives apart from whatever she was indoctrinated into. So I definitely think as a species we're going to be stuck being gynocentric, but I think people can at least become aware of this stuff. And I mean, I wouldn't say there's some hope there, but it's a nice thing. But I'm just rambling now. I guess my point is that, you know, even if we defeat this specter of feminism and nobody calls themselves a feminist, you know, 90%, upwards of 90% of homeless are still going to be men. I don't really see, a huge difference, and all the benefits that have been put in place are still going to be there. The child support racket, all of that stuff. If that could be done away with, that would be amazing. But talking about real world versus internet, if all this turns out to be in some giant internet battle where, you know, the anti-feminists win by saying, yeah, now we can say what we want to say and you can't tell us, and, you know, what does that actually change in the real world as far as gender relations are concerned? You know, so I think it's a pretty dismal prospect, and this is why, yeah, me personally, I don't spend much time with the anti-feminism thing, because I don't see it going anywhere.
Yeah, I think it's because it ultimately would come down to convincing enough people to fight their gynocentric urge and fight their gynocentric nature, which I
Yeah.
think is almost, I don't want to say it's almost an impossibility, but I think it's very unlikely. I mean, we might be able to, but there is very, very strong resistance to it.
Well, it's first off, I mean, especially as a man, as a heterosexual man, it's hard to resist the urge. I mean, I know from personal experience, even now, you kind of feel inclined just to be nice to women, for no other reason other than women, rather than just trying to be neutral and looking at all from a neutral stance. And
Yeah, it is difficult, and it's subconsciously difficult.
exactly,
That's the thing which makes it so difficult. And I think it kind of explains something, I think, a little bit about some of the more extremist fringe of MGTOW, because I've seen some of them, like, even just commenting on like some anti-feminist videos made by women, and they'll just come in and instantly bomb with, even like if the woman has made completely rational, logical points and cited all of their sources and their evidence, and people say, good sources, good evidence. And some of these MGTOW will just bomb in and be like, oh, look at all of these woman worshippers praising the pussy because she did something. It's like, what? What?
yeah,
It's sort of this outwards like hostility thing at this idea that, you can actually sort of see these people and say like, well, no, these are valid points. Why would you instantly leap to this? You can be nice to a woman without sort of caving to your gynocentric nature necessarily.
yeah. I think that's a really interesting point. I've sometimes wondered about the I don't know. You hate to use the term the angry MGTOWs, whatever that means. The guys who tend to be very reactive, and if part of that's just their own struggle to do away with their own innate gynocentric tendencies. I mean, I think it is difficult, and I think these tendencies are always there to some degree.
Mm.
But in those cases, I'm just wondering: are these guys that way because that's the only way they can deal with that? Otherwise, they would be throwing out the red carpet all the time. I
I
don't really
think it
know.
might be that I think for some of them they do actually genuinely have to default to quite an aggressive position, because in their mind, like, even if they see a woman who makes like a genuinely positive good point, in their mind, if they acknowledge that, that is them caving to gynocentrism.
Yeah,
And so
yeah,
I don't know whether they necessarily use the aggression as sort of a cover to say like, no, I'm not going to fall into a trap, and they have to be almost sort of a celibate mode about it, where it's kind of like, no, just the easiest way is to just not engage, just don't do it at all. But then I think that's I don't know. There's not engaging, then there's being intentionally aggressive in your engagement.
well, I don't directly, I'm pretty celibate, but I don't feel any real aggression towards women. I mean,
What
I'm
these guys do, though, they see any male positive interaction with a woman as being manifestation of gynocentrism, and those men being controlled by those women, even when it's not, even when it's just like, no, this is just one person rationally engaging with another and realizing that they made a good point or they did something well.
Yeah, I mean this goes back to. I mean, this has been argued. What is the definition of MGTOW? I'm not going to get into that. Who knows? I guess a lot of people say just don't get married, whatever. But certain MGTOW doing certain things that's not MGTOW, or they are doing certain things, and it's just kind of meaningless. I've been called the monk of MGTOW, even though uh, that's never been defined, and I've gone on record to say no. I'm actually not categorically opposed to relationships. It's just unless certain conditions are met, I don't bother with them. But that doesn't mean I'm categorically opposed to them. So there are all kinds of weird. It's complicated, but I think the problem with the gynocentrism thing as well is that unless you're aware of it, that there's even such a thing, it just happens automatically most of the time. You're just you're nice to the girl, you're helpful, you're this or that, and it once people. This is just my suspicion. I'm just throwing ideas out. The really angry guys, I suspect, at least, I suspect that a lot of that comes from this feeling of, oh my God, I've been controlled by these instincts and impulses all this time, and I've been acting like a fool. And then they think, I found the responsible parties, and it's women,
Mm.
and so they kind of overreact to that. Whereas the reality is, at the end of the day, we only have control of ourselves. So you have to regulate your own behavior. I mean, women are going to be women, and women are gynocentric too. They have in-group preference. I mean, you can't, you're not going to do anything about them. You have to do something about yourself. And not to mention, being perpetually angry isn't particularly healthy or fun.
You think it might be a sort of misdirected rage issue, like they're actually more angry at themselves and they're just not willing to accept the responsibility?
I think so. I think that's my impression often, because it yeah, it's just a shock. I mean, if you grow up in a society where you've been told your entire life that you know you're you're an oppressor class and you've been at the top, and women have suffered this and that, and you have that really just turned on its head, and you realize that when it comes to privilege, overall, men have a few, but women tend to have a lot more, and they're treated a lot better by most people. And it just seems so, at least to the indoctrination we've received, so it runs so counter to that, right? That that can definitely set off a rage, because it feels like you've been manipulated, and in fact, it is a
Mm.
manipulation, right? And I mean, nobody reacts well to being manipulated. All of a sudden, you're, oh wait, it wasn't that way, and I've been
Well,
doing
it's the "I've been lied to all my life" moment.
exactly, exactly. Well, that's what it is. Yeah, I think we all have different ways of dealing with it, and at some point, this is years ago, I might have been a little bit angry, but they're different. They're different varieties of people. Everyone's different. But essentially, yeah, I've been lied to my whole life. It's not like this at all, and what do I do about it? And for some guys, my feeling is, rage mode is the only way. For me, it's just to disengage and just observe things as neutrally as I can, because I can't change the world. We just said we can't change gynocentrism, because until the I've been thinking about this a lot. In MGTOW circles, there's a lot of theorizing about things like artificial wombs. I don't these days put much credence in it, but the idea, if gynocentrism can be reduced to the idea of sperm cheap, wombs expensive, if technology such as artificial wombs, and this is science fiction, it's not quite science fiction, but it's pretty far out there. If that could actually change the dynamic, if the most valuable, if the thing that makes women valuable, and then all this behavior we have is derived from that, could somehow be mitigated or circumvented by technological means, I wonder if we would have different attitudes. I don't think so, because I think it's so ingrained in our brains that it would just continue nonetheless. But I have thought about that, as a means of sort of lessening. I mean, but then again, I don't know, it's probably just an impossible. I'm rambling again. An impossible enterprise. It just doesn't. It's not very helpful to get angry about it. It's not fair. It's not just, and I don't like that, but I can't change it either. So
Mm. I think
I
there is that has to come with that degree of acceptance. Just like sometimes you have to just look at the world and say it is what it is.
exactly,
And I think that's something very difficult for a lot of people to do because, and I hate pulling us back to social justice warriors, but inevitably it's what I do.
yeah,
They are very against this idea of it is how it is, deal with it. In their minds, they must
yeah,
always be an agent for social change. Like to them, it's kind of like, oh, if you can't get a world that's 100% correct, oh, you should at least aim for 99% correct,
hmm,
in my subjective opinion, according to them. This idea that you can just look at things and just say, just accept it and change will happen or it won't happen. It's not right, it's not wrong, it just is. Make the most of it. I think
yeah.
they're very opposed to this idea.
Yeah, and I think this is a challenge for a lot of people. Oftentimes, we just have to accept things. I mean, the counterpart to acceptance is combativeness and getting angry, and that usually doesn't lead to change. So what's the option? But yeah, you're right. Social justice warriors, sometimes, if they're idealistic at least, think that they can change the world, and they some things just are the way they are. And I think I think if you're involved in MGTOW circles or the manosphere, there are different ways to react. But when you're not, when you find out the big lie is a lie, and you find out that actually, unless you're doing something important, you're pretty much shit on the soles of someone's foot. Uh, you know, it's hard to accept that you just have to accept that.
Hmm.
No, it's
I think that's the case throughout all of human history, though.
yeah, yeah,
Everyone has, had life that is always less than what they would want it to be. It's
oh,
just a case of whether you're able to deal with it or not.
of course, but I don't see any alternative. Acceptance can help you deal with it if you just accept things for how they are. It's the idea of you can find this. Maybe you always wished you were, assuming you're not 6'6", but you're not. So don't spend a day worrying about it. That kind of thing.
Hmm.
Do what you can within the confines of your life and the limits that nature and the environment has imposed on you. But certain things you can't change. And this is, by the way, a huge beef between, well, a beef. It's a point of conflict between quote unquote MRAs, which I've never been, and MGTOW, because many MGTOW, including myself, think you can't change the world. You can't change this basic sort of gynocentric equation. We're stuck with it. And deal with it. We deal with it on your own personal terms. Arrange your life such that you can live a contented life without feeding into it more than you have to, and without being dependent upon your own gynocentrism. A dependence on, for example, on having female companionship as a prerequisite for contentment. For example, that's a good example of that. Whereas MRAs often think, yeah, we can lobby this, we can petition for this. But what they fail to realize that in a gynocentric world, men, unless you're doing something important, you're invisible. People generally don't care about what's happening with men. Look at the amount of health money spent on men compared to women. It seems to be a doomed endeavor. And so even in the manosphere, you have this fracturing. That's why I'm not an MRA, and I think they're kind of wasting their time. But yeah. Oh, okay. We are over 2 hours now. That was an interesting conversation. We're gonna, I think, wrap it up. But always a pleasure. I hope, obviously, everyone who's not subbed to Teal Deer, I would recommend it. He is, as I've said, in my opinion, the best of the feminist responders out there. And yeah, I think it's been an interesting conversation, and we will wrap it up there. So thanks for being here, and
it's been an absolute honor and a pleasure as usual.
yeah, cheers.